How does looking up versus looking down on people relate to living out your values? Because it's really easy to find yourself looking down on others as you're trying to live up to your own values, and sort of, instead of looking up at the ideals that you're trying to achieve, you spend a lot of time looking down at people who don't achieve those ideals. And of course, that's going to be destructive to you. It's going to potentially be destructive to other people, or to the sort of social environment that you're creating by looking down at people. But it's really important to think through how these relate to each other. And one example I might use would be minimalism or simple living. This is a good value. A lot of people aspire to live up to a simple lifestyle without too much attachment to their things. Wonderful ideal, wonderful thing to try to live out in your life. And so with that value, you might imagine two scenarios or two types of people. One type of person, when they talk about their minimalism, is going to say things like, living minimally helps me free up mental and emotional space such that I can invest it in my friendships and in my artistic pursuits and in other things that are really valuable to me. And they might talk about what they experienced when they started to live a minimalist lifestyle, where they were giving away their things, they were severing unhealthy emotional attachments to buying stuff and purchasing and shopping, and that freed them up to invest more in people. So that's a wonderful value to live out. On the other end of the spectrum, we could have someone who aspires to the same set of values, who instead of looking up is going to be looking down on other people who don't achieve those values. So that might look something like this. That person has so much clutter in their life. They're clearly constantly being manipulated by the capitalistic forces in society. They're always buying new stuff. They're always wearing new clothing. They don't even think about the environmental impact of all the stuff they're buying. They don't think about the child labor going into all that clothing they're buying. It's so gross how much stuff they buy, how much clutter is in their house. It makes me feel really icked out being around that kind of thing. So you can see the second example is aspiring to the same set of values as the first. It's just one is looking up to the ideal and the other is looking down on people who are not living out that ideal well. And as you might imagine, my perspective on this is that the second version of living out your values, where it's mostly focused on the people who are not doing a good job or not doing as good of a job as you at living out your values, that is completely destructive, both to yourself and potentially to relationships and to the sort of social space that you set up around you. There's just something about looking down on others that's like this boomerang that sort of comes back and makes you feel judged by others all of the time. There's some psychological principle behind this, where if you're constantly judging, you're going to be projecting that onto others and perceiving them as constantly judging everyone around them, which includes you. In fact, it's probably going to be way more unhealthy for you than for the people who are out there with their clutter, buying their stuff from the dollar shop, who are not really thinking about minimalism, not really thinking about what they're doing. If they're living in a way that's not judgmental, that's sort of living out perhaps different values than you, then they may not feel the judgment coming from you, because if judgment isn't in their head, they'll project that onto people around them, and they won't experience the environment as being quite so judgmental. So when we interpret our environments, our social environments, and particularly when we interpret what's going on inside people's heads, we have a strong tendency to project whatever's going on in our heads as being more common in other people's heads than perhaps is the case. Also, this is a problem because looking down on others is inherently contemptuous. And John Gottman is a researcher who studies relationships and has shown that contempt is the #1 predictor of marriage breakup. And so if it's that toxic for marriage breakups, it's also going to be toxic for friendships and coworker relationships and other types of relationships in your life. So the looking down on others version of living out your values is super unhealthy. But it's a little bit less simple than I've made it seem so far. And one reason for this is that judgment is one way to get a community of people to behave in more pro-social ways. So let me use a different example, which is environmental activism. And I want to say before I give this example, I actually still think the looking down on others version of this is super unhealthy and also generally ineffective. But you could imagine situations where it might be effective. So here's the example. If the value you're trying to live up to is environmental activism, a person who's engaging in the looking up version of this might say something like, I recycle everything I own, I'm minimizing my trash, I'm trying to inspire other people to recycle by showing them how cool it is. I'm also studying engineering to try to develop products that reduce the environmental impact of basic things like cars and air conditioners and things that are currently hurting the environment. So all of that stuff is sort of looking up to the ideal of achieving the value. A looking down version of this might be, oh my gosh, I can't believe he throws away plastic bottles. Ugh. Does he even care about his carbon footprint? I swear it never crosses his mind. He's just like raping the planet and we can't do anything about it. There's so many people like him, and that's the problem with the world. It's like those people who don't even care the effect they're having on future generations. Those people only care about themselves. It makes me sick to my stomach when I see people who don't recycle things like that. It's just like, how can they not do that? How can they not even care? You kind of get the picture. And obviously, I do not support the second version. As a matter of fact, I think that is super unhealthy and not really going to change behavior. But you could imagine a situation where creating a very judgmental environment towards people who don't recycle or people who behave in antisocial ways is going to enforce behaviors that might otherwise be hard to enforce. As a matter of fact, the environmental example has the drop in the bucket problem that everybody kind of knows that their contribution to environmental damage is so small that they can't really save the environment by changing their behavior that much. But what really changes the environment is the collective choices, where all of those drops in the bucket add up to an ocean. And how do you solve these problems where one person's behavior is a drop in the bucket, but the collective behavior is huge? Well, one way of solving this kind of problem is to enforce that behavior socially. Like if we could get everybody to be super judgmental about people who don't recycle, recycling will go up. And so there is an argument for the looking down version of living out your values. The problem is if we create a society where people are super aware of all these problems that need social enforcement, and where people's main ethical and moral contribution to solving these problems is judging others, where my moral act is sort of judging everyone I see who throws a plastic bottle in the trash. That kind of society is going to have higher levels of recycling, but it will also create this social space that is absolutely dripping with judgment. And that's going to contribute to mental health problems. It's going to contribute to just a society where there's no space for people to have different values and different approaches. My personal recommendation for anyone who wants to actually have an impact on the world is to minimize the looking down version of your values and to maximize the looking up version. Because my belief is that when people are giving of themselves to important causes, coming from a place of I'm inspired, I want to move toward that rather than I'm afraid of being judged for not doing it, that positive inspiration version sort of expands the amount of yourself that you have to give to different values and different causes. That is my viewpoint, but I acknowledge that there are other ways of looking at this. Now, there are a couple of other asterisks I would like to add to this analysis. And one is the fact that people are feeling super judged nowadays because we spend time online where there's constant judgment going on. Sometimes people will encourage you to give up your values because when you have those values, they feel judged. And you've probably heard this. Like an example might be, you know someone who volunteers at the nursing home twice a week. And this comes up in conversation and someone at the table is like, oh, aren't you the do-gooder going to the nursing home twice a week? And obviously that's sort of a jibe at them for trying to live up to their values. And the person who's taking the shot at the nursing home do-gooder is feeling judged and and they don't like the feeling of feeling judged. So they're sort of like, look at you living up to your values. And the problem here is that someone doesn't have to judge you for you to feel judged. You can feel judged just because someone is living up to their values. And you see this with health and fitness sometimes too, where when someone starts to build up their body or lose a little bit of weight and get healthier, sometimes they will get negative comments and negative reactions from people in their lives because those people are sort of recognizing that they're not living up to that value of health and they're feeling judged whether or not the person is actually judging them. And so while the judgment is something that I think is really bad, it's worth staying away from any kind of perspective where you're looking down at others. All of that I believe. But don't let people shame you for having values and trying to live up to them. They may feel judged by that. That doesn't mean you're judging them, and it's important to keep that boundary, that separation between the two. Now, one more asterisk I would like to add here is that it is sometimes necessary, if you're going to grow in a skill, to look at examples of people doing something wrong. So you might think of this in terms of fitness. With fitness, you want to be inspired by how good you're going to feel when you get fit, by fitting into those old jeans from high school, all of that stuff. That's the looking up version. The looking down version of fitness, of course, would be, oh my gosh, I can't believe that person let themselves go after college. They probably gained 20 pounds. Look at them. I never want to be like that. Smack me if I'm ever like that. You know, that's the looking down version of the person who's trying to live up to a value of fitness and health, right? That's not good at all. But if you are going to improve in your skill for fitness, you not only have to look at what is the right way of lifting weights, what is the right way of counting calories or not counting calories or whatever, but you have to look at the wrong ways because there's lots of mistakes that you might make as you're pursuing this, and you have to correct those mistakes. So oftentimes if you're researching how to get better at something, they give you tips to get better, but they also give common pitfalls. And it is important to look at those pitfalls. It's just important to sort of look at the pitfalls as I need to avoid those mistakes so that I can get better, rather than focusing on the person who made the pitfall who isn't living up to the value in a good way. So it really is about focus. This really is about what kinds of things are you thinking about? What kinds of things are you talking about with your friends as you try to live out these values?